So wait until the end for questions. Any questions along the way, or how would you like to do it?
Doesn't matter.
Okay. All right.
Questions along the way are fine.
Okay. All right. Many of you probably are familiar with Professor Rogers. He's been here a number of times speaking to adult education classes, and he's going to talk today on scholarly books on Christianity. I'm very pleased to have Rick here. He's one of my dear colleagues at Eastern Michigan University, teaches in the history department. He's been there, how many years you say?
27.
27 years teaching at Eastern Michigan University. So he knows what he's talking about. Okay, go ahead, Rick.
All right, thank you so much. Happy Mother's Day. All right. I'm going to go through a few books here that I like, books that I think are fun to read. Oftentimes, as Ron knows, we have books for our students that we recommend. And if we don't recommend a book that is easy to read and enjoyable and fun for students, they're not going to read it. They'll pretend to, they might flip through a little bit, sufficient to handle their exams, but other than that, they probably aren't going to spend much time to it. So I like to give, especially when I'm doing first year, second year courses, freshman, sophomore courses, use narrative type books that tell a story. And they need to read almost like a novel. So I try to find books like that. It doesn't matter the size of them as long as they're well written, good scholarship, of course, but something that's engaging and scintillating for the students to enjoy. And so that's the kind of books I've come up with for you. Ron asked me to do good books on scholarship, but also books that are fun to read. That's the intent here when it comes to my students. The first book I'm going to recommend, and all these books are based on courses I teach. So I'm beginning with one course I teach to sophomores. I created it. Early on I called it History and Religion and Violence, and then I changed it and made it a regular part of the curriculum for a while. It was known as the Abrahamic Religions in Conflict and Dialogue, and it focused primarily on the Abrahamic religions, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But early on I used this book. I thought it was a very good book. It's sort of what gave me the impetus to go ahead and create this sort of course and teach it. And it's kind of an unusual name. It's not a particularly large book. All the books I'm going to recommend to you get in paperback, and they're cheap too. That's the other thing I forgot to mention. Students want cheap books. They don't want expensive textbooks. It's hard to get away from those sometimes with entry-level courses, but if you can, you're better off to get a book that they will actually buy, and sometimes you'll have students who won't buy the big expensive books. But if you can get them to buy the book, read the book, and enjoy it, those are important elements. So this book is such a book, but it's dealing with problems of violence and religion in all kinds of places and times, and lots of good stories in here. But the intent of this book is to actually lay out a sort of a program for understanding when some religions get a little wacky, they kind of go off kilter. The vast majority of religions, as this gentleman believes, Charles Kimball, are, especially if they're religions that have a history, they've been around for a long time. If they've been around for a long time, obviously they must be doing something right. Yes? I mean, they must be doing something that's working for people, or people would reject them and they would go extinct. And as historians, we know there are literally hundreds and hundreds of religions that have gone extinct over time. We know what they are. Sometimes we get a little curious and want to study them, but they've disappeared. They're no longer around. So they're not religions that anybody would be attracted to today. But certainly the five main religions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are religions that have sustained themselves over time and have grown and had a very powerful effect upon people and civilizations in general. So what he tries to do is he says these religions have been around for a long time. Even on occasion, they sometimes go wacky. They go off a little bit. because of some of the people who practice them, they go off in directions that actually hurt their cause and are not promoting what's best about the teachings of any various religion. So he gives 5 principles that he lays out, and he puts them in chapter form, each of these principles, and then he gives examples, historical examples, current examples of how these are problem area issues. The first one is when religions start making a lot of absolute truth claims. Nothing wrong with truth claims. Religions are going to make truth claims, of course, but on occasion they can go off the rails a little bit and push to the extreme their idea of what's true and what's not true, and become hard line on that issue. And so he says, now this is something you need to keep your eye on. When you see these truth claims, absolute truth claims being made over and over again, doesn't mean the religion's gone bad. Just keep your eyes on it and be aware that this could be problematic. And then he gives you some examples to help you see how that might be the case. Blind obedience. When religions find themselves, or some faction within a particular religious community finds itself drawing people away. We sometimes think of those as cults, right? When they draw people away and they don't allow their members to speak with their family and that sort of thing. But even mainstream religions on occasion will engage in that kind of activity. So you need to keep your eyes on that when there's a kind of blind obedience, particularly to charismatic leaders within a particular religious group. Of course, almost all religions began with charismatic leaders that made a difference. But now that these major religions, mainstream religions, are so large, they seem to have enculturated themselves with society, and they're certainly doing something right, meeting the needs of certain people. So be aware of that. Absolute truth claims, blind obedience is the second one. The third one is establishing the ideal time, which students sometimes find the most difficult notion to get a hold of. Ideal time. Anyone got an idea what that might mean? Establishing an ideal time. You have an ideal time?
It would be like the future when everything is perfect, or the
Yes, right. When every day's Thanksgiving, right?
Yeah.
Or every day's Christmas, that sort of thing. And almost certainly with some of these religions, like Christianity and Islam, they tend to look forward to an ideal age in the future, a kind of apocalyptic way of thinking that what's bad in this world will come to an end, and all the things that we think of as good in this world will be highlighted and they will be primary. And he says you got to be a little careful about that too. In fact, it can work in reverse, right? Some religious groups say, let's get back to the good old days, right? Make America great again. Yeah. So get back to the good old days. Sometimes Christians think that during the days of Jesus, when he was walking this earth, wouldn't it be wonderful to walk around with Jesus and get to hear him and talk to him and that sort of thing, as did the disciples? Wouldn't it be great if we could be a part of that world? And so there are these kind of restoration theologies that begin in some forms of Christianity, particularly conservative or evangelical Christianity, that are designed to help us imagine what that world may have looked like and see if we can't somehow replicate it in some way or another, and get back to that moment when there was that kind of intimacy between Jesus and his disciples. And so we look for that sort of thing. And some church communities really go overboard in trying to make that happen in their churches. I mean, you could walk into their churches and all of a sudden it feels like you're in another world, an ancient world. And they're trying to promote that sort of restorationist theology. And we have lots of denominations within Christianity that attempt to do that. But this trying to establish an ideal time, either from the past or in the future in some way, can be reasons for things going off the rails for mainstream religions. So pay attention to those kinds of things he's recommending. And again, he gives lots of examples where that's not done and causes all sorts of problems. And so you get some detail here dealing with that. The end justifies the means. That's kind of an easy one whenever a religion seems to think, whatever the ends are, that's what's important. If we could get people into our church, it doesn't matter how we do it, right? That's just, if we have to go out and drag them in some fashion. Be aware of that. Declaring a holy war is the last one. And that's sort of obvious, I would guess, when there's a tendency on the part of particular segments within any religious group that stress the idea that maybe a holy war isn't so bad. I have one author that I'm going to introduce you to who actually wrote a book about during the days of World War I. There was a real attempt to treat World War I as a holy war. And for us, of course, that's part of the ancient past now, so it's hard to think how that might have been the case, because we tend to look at that kind of secular war as just that. But there were people who saw it as a kind of holy war that they were fighting. So those are the kinds of things he works with. I really like this book for the course I was teaching, but when I changed it, the course, to just the Abrahamic religions, I had to find another book, because this one's going all over the map with various religious groups. So, done with that one. By the way, that's him. That's Charles Kimball, and that's me. We look like brothers, I think. We're actually the same age, the exact same age. He teaches at the University of Oklahoma and has been there for a long time. And he came to Ann Arbor a while back, gave some lectures at the University of Michigan, and I was a part of those. Well, he wrote another book, and he kind of liked the title of his first book, so he sort of stayed with that, When Religion Becomes Legal. And this is the one then that I recommended for students in my class to read. And I worked with this for quite a few years. The undertitle is The Explosive Mix of Politics and Religion in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Just what I needed. Perfect. And what he does is he goes through each of those religions in turn to deal with them. He got his doctoral degree at Harvard. While he was at Harvard, one of his professors was invited to be a part of a delegation that actually went to Iran during the hostage crisis under Carter. You remember that? And he went, and he went several times, in fact, and got to sit down with the Ayatollah Khomeini and talk with him. And he liked him. He liked the Ayatollah Khomeini. He found him an interesting guy. And he starts off with that story right here in the first part of his book. The title is Christmas with the Ayatollah. He went on Christmas Day, sat down with the Ayatollah and had a really fine, interesting conversation. Found him to be a caring father and grandfather who was worried about his family. And so he's had done a lot of work in the Middle East, particularly in Israel. Everybody knows him in Israel. As soon as he gets off the plane, all eyes fall upon him, the official eyes, right, that need to know whether you should be here or not, kind of thing, a bit of a concern, because he has some critical things to say about the state of Israel. So that's the book I decided to use to talk about. What else can I say about this one? I'd highly recommend it. Both of these books. I think they'd be great on your shelf upstairs. Okay, you have any questions about these two books so far? That's as a sophomore class I was teaching, History 202 was the term. I created it. No one else teaches it. That's the nice thing about creating your own course. Only you can teach it, right? So that keeps me employed. But mostly sophomores, some freshmen, and then there were some others who were just interested in the subject. I used to teach it in the classroom. It became rather contentious in the classroom. So I decided, maybe I better do this online. And it worked out perfectly online. Nobody's contentious. And if they are, they're just contentious with me, right? It's really tough, as again, Ron and others of you who are teachers probably know, that when you stand in the classroom and some student raises holy heck about something you're teaching, it kind of puts a damper on the class, and it's hard to get it back. It's important for teachers to have the trust of their students, and if they lose the trust of their students, the class is going to go downhill rather quickly, especially for discussions. So you need to hang on to that trust, and it's tricky. Particularly with college students, it's tricky because they're smart, you know. They will find the holes in your arguments and that sort of thing if you're not careful. And if you have some in your class that just intentionally want to be contentious, then they create some problems. Okay, so that was. Any questions about either of these?
They're both in paperback?
The first one's in paperback, the second one isn't yet, so I don't know if it will
Do
be
they
or
stand
not.
alone?
What's that?
Do they stand alone, or
Oh, yes.
you don't have to read one to
No.
get to the other?
No, they stand alone. But as I say, this one became a really good textbook. And it's just an easy read, engaging. And again, that's the sort of thing I'm looking for in books, that they're engaging, they draw students in. Any questions about them? Is this an area you think you might be interested in reading?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe. Might want to pick up one of these books? All right, good. Next one I'm going to mention is I've also used in this course. I brought a paperback version of it called Laying Down the Sword. Why We Can't Ignore the Bible's Violent Verses by Philip Jenkins. Philip Jenkins teaches at both Baylor University in Texas, which is a liberal Baptist school, which is kind of rare in Texas to find liberal Baptists, but they're there. Same with Charles Kimball. He's a Baptist, but not a Southern Baptist. He calls himself another kind of Baptist. He's not really an American Baptist because he lives in the South. He can't be an American Baptist, or a Northern Baptist. So another thing about Kimball is he Jewish heritage, became a Baptist minister, and then went to university and got his PhD to teach. He teaches at Oklahoma University. Philip Jenkins teaches at Baylor. He teaches also at Penn State University and has been at these schools for quite some time. He's an Anglican, so he's got an accent, which is kind of nice when students hear him. I use a lot of YouTube videos in class as well, and have students write reviews on the YouTube videos that they watch. That engages them, you know. They enjoy doing that sort of thing. So I have them listen to him because he's just got a beautiful way of talking and presenting his case. What's interesting about this book is it does focus on the Bible, but it also looks at the Quran, looks at both the Jewish Bible, the Torah, the Tanakh, as well as the Christian Bible, which of course includes the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And so he looks for all these passages that are complicated, problematic type passages when it comes to violence. If you were to pick out two books in the Bible that you think probably have an awful lot of violence going on in, what two books would those be? One in the Old Testament, one in the New Testament.
First book of Samuel?
First book of Samuel's got some stuff that's a little rough, but we can get rougher in the Hebrew Bible. Joshua, yeah, the book of Joshua. There's this command on the part of God when the Hebrew people are coming back from the Exodus to Joshua himself, the lieutenant of Moses, saying, when you go in, destroy these towns. And how do you destroy the town? You destroy everything. Man, woman, child, animal, everything. Razz it to the ground. So he tries to deal with those passages, particularly one group of people where God wasn't happy with at all, which were the Canaanite Amalekites. And so there's this Amalekite stories that he looks at in some depth. What about the New Testament?
Revelation.
Yeah, you can't beat Revelation for violence, although it's future violence, yeah? And so because it's future violence, it seems like pretend violence. It doesn't feel really real, especially given the fact that there are all these weird symbolic ideas to be found in it. But of course, in the book of Revelation, it's talking about, like wiping out everybody who walks on the face. That's kind of spooky stuff. And so he deals with those kinds of passages. And what he does is he comes up with a comparison between passages in the Quran with passages in the Bible, particularly these two books, and he ends up with a sort of table of various types of classifying violence and disturbing scriptures. One is extreme, that's one category. The other is alarming, and the one that's the least problematic is disturbing. And he comes up with some numbers. So disturbing, alarming, and extreme. And he comes up with some numbers for all of these various passages. And there's no contest here. The Bible just wipes out any other sacred literature in terms of the kind of violent passages that Christians and Jews have to figure out how to deal with. And that's his thing. How do we figure out how to deal with that? Because he's Anglican, he's coming from a Christian background, he wants to figure out how to deal with these kinds of passages. Well, one way we deal with it, and maybe a way that you might deal with it here at Zion, since this is a mainstream Lutheran church, how do you think your ministerial staff deals with that as they teach you?
Well, focus on the other aspects, the love aspects.
Oh, sure. Yeah, focus on those.
We are both saint and sinner.
And what?
And sinner. We are saint and sinner.
A realization of our anthropological makeup, right? We're both saints and sinners. Good. What else?
Well, if it's the Old Testament, you could say that was the Old Testament as opposed to the New Testament, which...
Yeah, you got the book of Revelation, the New Testament.
Well, that's a problem.
Sorry, we don't teach it that often.
There you go. That's the answer. That's it. You have something called a lectionary. Anyone know what a lectionary is?
Yep.
Yeah, what is it?
The plan.
It's the plan, right? For the sermons, right? It's the reading of the scriptures and the sermons that come your way. So what he's done is, as an Anglican, he spent a great deal of time looking at the lectionary, the readings, and what does he find? That lectionaries don't have many passages for the public to read that are violent passages, particularly passages from Joshua and Revelation.
Well,
Yep.
the lectionary, as it's approved by the Anglicans, the Catholics, and the Lutherans, is built around the life of Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
And the life of Jesus is pretty, until you get to the crucifixion part, you know, it's not too difficult to read, and there's lots of interesting, nice stuff there that is uplifting and feels beneficial to
emphasis
us.
is more on grace than on...
Yes, right. The idea of grace is a major thing. Of course, we theologize, right? It took 2,000 years to theologize on all this stuff in order to figure out what works well and what kind of language do we need to talk about these stories, these narratives, so that we feel comfortable with them and can benefit from them, can make use of them in our daily life. And grace is a word that has been worked over those 2,000 years of theology. Yeah. So at any rate, he goes through that kind of material and he comes up with some recommendations, which is preach on these passages. Forget the lectionary when you need to, pastor so-and-so, and preach on these difficult passages. And don't be afraid of them, but think about them, work with them. And if you can't come up with some good answers that make you feel good, just tell your congregation you can't come up with something that makes you feel good as a minister. People will understand. Life is complicated, and there are not perfect answers to everything in life. And the reason for me using a book like this with my students is students need to learn that. That's stuff you know. You know, you've been through a lot of living, and so you know the difficulty of life, but they don't. They're struggling with it still, and most of my students, and I'm sure it's true for Ron as well, like things black and white, right? They don't like the grays. They want things that are easy answers that they can walk away with, and they don't want to have to think too hard about some of these issues. At least entry-level students don't. We kind of mess them up in the entry-level classes so that by the time they get into the upper division classes, they're ready to start thinking and dealing with grace. But that's one of the reasons I use a book like this, because he's recommending this so for all community, all groups, all church groups. that pastors not be afraid to preach on those texts. So keep track of your minister. See if he's preaching on this day. And tell him, give it a shot. Give it a shot. Come on, you can do it. And we can take it. That's the other thing, too. He'll do it if you can take it. He or she will not do it if they think you can't take it. So you have to prepare yourself and say, look, we've lived a lot of life. We know there are difficult problems in life, and we can work with these sorts of things. So he does a pretty good job of that. Okay. Where's my clicker? Any questions about that book? So I use passages of that or chapters for my students. I don't give them the entire book as a textbook, but we talk about as much of it as we can. I used to teach a course in church history, and boy, I had a hard time finding a book that there are an awful lot of good big books on church history, and for me, they read like a delight. I enjoy big books written by good writers, but if you have too many complex or compound sentences, that's a problem for students. So, you need the simple. You don't want all simple. Simple sentences are engaging. There's a reason for simple sentences. They're good for rhetoric and certainly good for textbooks on occasion. But a lot of the books that I found, very fine books, were using some pretty sophisticated syntax. And on top of that, the problem with a lot of them, particularly if they're written for the general public and not textbooks. I was trying to get away from textbooks and the expense of them. If they're written for the general public, they oftentimes will use a lot of, particularly in church history, Hebrew words or Greek words or Latin words. Latin words a lot. Sometimes French and German words with no explanation. Now, once a student runs into that, they're going to stop reading. Especially if you recommend, just jump over it, don't worry about it. If you don't know, we'll explain it in class if you want it explained. Or you can nowadays just Google it, right? It's easy enough to do and get a pretty good answer. But sometimes students are too lazy to do the Google part, and they just, as easy as that is, hate to say that. Oh, no, you don't get students to the library anymore.
I know that.
You have to take them and walk them in and take them from shelf to shelf and pull out books. No. I've done that on occasion, but it's pretty hard to do that.
It isn't only with students.
Yes, with all of us. We're all busy people. Students are busy people, especially our students. I mean, I deeply admire our students. Many of them are working people, and they're out, trying to make a living as well as come to classes. So it can be difficult. Their time is important to them, and they have family issues they have to deal with. Sometimes they have their own families that they're dealing with, and so you got to find books. I found a pretty good one. It's called Church History. I didn't want a book that began with church history because it sounded a little too much like a seminary book. Well, this actually is written by a seminarian teacher at Denver Seminary, Bruce Shelley. But it's really well written. Big print. All students like that, big print. Easy to read. That means there's not as much on each page, right? So that's good. And in plain language, so it's easy, short sentences, but they're good sentences. And occasionally when he uses long sentences, okay, it works well in the text. And he never goes without explaining difficult problems that you might encounter, sociological terms that for many of us are easy to read because we do it all the time in scholarship. The students, it just drives them batty. So, and also foreign languages gives the actual translation. So that's a good book. And that was a 200 level, a sophomore type class for me for a while. I don't teach it anymore. But I did for a while. This one, many of you, I'm sure, because I know Ron likes Bart Ehrman and has used him in one of the classes here. But this is a terrific book called The Triumph of Christianity, How a Forbidden Religion Swept the World. I use this text as a review text in my 300 level course, upper division course, on early Christianity, the history of early Christianity. Okay, and it comes in paperback too. This is it. I again like big books. All these books are around 300 pages. So if you have a book that's easy to read, fun to read, students will read 300 pages or more. I had one student this semester. He's an honors student, and he read a 900-page book on one guy and wrote a review of it. I didn't see it coming, but the review was 50 pages long, so it was well written and it was good. And of course, he got his honors credit for the course. So that happens.
What was the book?
It was on. I'm trying to think now. It was not Wesley, but Jonathan Edwards. Big book on Jonathan Edwards by a former professor of mine. That's the reason I recommended it to him, because I thought he'd be interested. George Marsden. I hate to say this in a Lutheran church, but I did my undergraduate work at Calvin College in Grand Rapids. Sorry. But George Marsden was one of my profs there, and he went on to Notre Dame, Duke before that for a while, and he's retired now, but he's now the guy in Jonathan Edwards. And this kid really wanted to read Jonathan Edwards, so he actually wrote two books, a little small one and a great big one. The small ones for the general public he thought might be willing to read it, and the big ones for scholars. And this kid said, I want to read the big one, so go ahead, read it. And he did, and he wrote this humongous paper. But he also had to read this book and write a review on it. So it's pretty good. Let me read a little bit from this. How are we doing on time?
You got another 15 minutes.
That's it? Oh man, look at all those books you have. Okay. Let's see, where should I begin here? Why did this new faith take over the Roman world, leading to the Christianization of the West? It is obviously not a matter of pure antiquarian interest, relevant only to academic historians. What question could be more important for anyone interested in history, culture, and society? Before 4 centuries had passed, these 20 or so lower class illiterate Jews, he's talking about the disciples, from rural Galilee had become a church of some 30 million in such a short period of time. How does a religion gain 30 million adherents in 300 years? How does that happen? Any ideas? Divine providence is the one. It's quite often. He says, as a historian, that's fine. I can respect that thought. But the other idea, more secular idea, would be what? You want to have an idea? Constantine. Constantine becomes a Christian, so why shouldn't the rest of the empire become Christian? And if they don't, maybe they'll get in trouble, right? Because the emperors now are Christian. So that's the normal secular answer that is usually given. He thinks that's wrong. He says even without Constantine, Christianity would have been up there as one of the major religions of the Roman Empire, and maybe eventually the dominant religion, the legitimized religion of the empire. But the answer he comes up with is the nature of Christianity itself. And he writes this entire book to make his case, and gives lots and lots of examples. Anyone have a thought of what might be another sort of secular answer to this?
It's shared from one to the other.
The way it's shared, the way it's passed, but a lot of pagan religions were passed the same way, within families and the like. But for some reason, they declined, and this one grew. Liberation.
Sort of as part of a political movement as well.
Yeah, the kind of liberating ideas, class issues, the stories of Jesus in relationship with women and slaves and that sort of thing might have given some rise to this religion. Lots and lots of answers, he said, but the major answer, he concludes, is the nature of Christianity, which is a religion of exclusivism. Now, Judaism was a religion of exclusivism as well, but it was an ethnic exclusivism, right? The chosen people. Christianity is similar to Judaism, out of which it came, but it's a religion that is designed for to cross ethnic boundaries, gender boundaries, class boundaries, all that sort of thing. But it's exclusive. Paganism didn't work that way. Paganism said essentially, you got a new religion? Come on, join us, that's good. A new God to worship, If it works for you, that's fine. It may work for us. There was more of an inclusive nature to a lot of the religions in the ancient world. But those that were more exclusivistic had a greater chance of winning because they said, you convert to our religion if you think we got some good stuff to offer you, and exclude the other religions that you were a part of. And as more and more were doing that, the religion began to grow faster and faster. So he kind of makes a case that that's one element that a lot of historians, as well as the general Sunday school public, right, have never really heard too much about. This idea that a religion that says other religions have to go if you join our religion. And so he gives a lot of statistics and numbers that are good that way, but he writes well. And he writes with questions. That's the other thing with students. If you have good questions in your text, then that draws students, it engages them, draws them in. So this is another good book, and it's in paperback now. So I highly recommend it. All right, probably less than 10 minutes, huh? I taught a course in the history of Jesus. A lot of good books on the historical Jesus. Paula Fredrickson, who trained at Oxford University, teaches at Boston University and Hebrew University in Jerusalem, has written this really fine book of looking at Jesus from a Jewish perspective. There were lots of scholars who've done that. She also brings a Christian perspective in, as coming from a Christian background herself, Jewish ethnicity, Christian religion, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And I'd highly recommend this. It's been around for a while, but it really reads well, and I think you would enjoy it. Here's a good book. This one, Paul Foster. This is just a collection of scholarly materials, and I use this in my class on early Christianity as well. I have students pick out one of the scholars they want to read, and this deals with more of an analytic analysis of each of these thinkers. And I was invited to write one of the chapters, so that's one of the reasons I think it's a really good book. A chapter on Theophilus in Antioch by Rick Rogers. So you'll need to get this on your shelf. But I make my students buy the book because I want to make sure, and it's put out by InterVarsity Academics, so it's even the conservative students are a little more likely to buy something from InterVarsity, and it's relatively cheap, inexpensive. So I highly recommend that for your shelf if you have the time to get it up there. This fine little book, The Myth of Persecution by Candida Moss. She was, for a number of years, a young scholar working at Notre Dame, now at British University. She's British herself. How early Christians invented a story of martyrdom. And not that there aren't stories of martyrdom, and that the kind of persecutions that took place in early Christianity, not that they weren't true and devastating to many Christian communities, but there are some issues with those stories. And she looks at Fox's Book of Martyrs, and you'd find that a rather interesting story that she has to tell about that particular book that was published in the reign of Elizabeth I, and what it was designed to accomplish. And it gave rise to a lot of the kind of Sunday school vision that we have of the early Christian persecutions. And so she challenges that by looking at that book and also looking at the ancient stories that we have. And it's easy to read. You can plow right through it. Highly recommend it. Jesus and the Life of Brian. Also a really good book here. Again, a collection of articles that I recommend to you. And they're based on lectures that were given at Cambridge University. One of the scholars that spoke was Bart Ehrman as well, and his article is in the book. So you might find that interesting. If you like the movie, I'm sure you'll like the book. Early History of American Christianity. This is the textbook I used for it. This should be on your shelves upstairs by Gostad. A really, really fine, easy to read, enjoyable to read textbook. One of the books that I have all my students read is by John Meacham, American Gospel. So at the end of the course, it's a 300 level course. I have them do a review of that book as well. Another big book. I don't have time to talk about it. Oh, here we go. Have any read the Mueller report yet? I just got a copy of it. I'm going to make my way through it this summer as quickly as I can. I understand it reads well and that it's well written. So, but one of the things I hear from my students so often, particularly in the history of American religions, is how could evangelicals be so gung-ho on Trump? It just doesn't seem to be a good fit. You know, but this book, I have never had a good answer for them. I've struggled with my answers trying to explain how that might be. But John Fee, who teaches at Messiah University, he's an evangelical himself in Pennsylvania, has written this book. I haven't read it yet, but all my mentors have and told me it's a very good book, so I'm looking forward to going through that this summer. If you like a little sex with your Bible reading, this will be the book for you by Jennifer Wright News. The Bible's Surprising Contradictions About Sex and Desire. Again, a very scholarly book that deals with the subject that we oftentimes don't deal with in Sunday school classes, but probably should a little bit more. But looking at social history and trying to analyze that a little bit. Galileo Goes to Jail. This is a terrific book that gives you a lot of short analysis on myths in the history of science and so forth. One last book I'll mention really quickly. I taught a course in the Holocaust a couple of years ago, for a couple of years, and there's no better book, I think, out there on the Holocaust, just a general history of the Holocaust. If you're interested in that, Lawrence Rees's book, The Holocaust. So, highly recommend that. Okay, am I done? Is my time done?
Yeah, well, you got time for questions.
Time for questions or comments? Sorry, I rushed here at the end. Yes, sir.
So as an educator, I don't actually find that your sort of characterization of early students to sort of lack sort of parallels to not only older students, but sort of our entire society in terms of sort of what they're willing to do in order to learn.
Yeah, you're asking a question, or?
Well, I was just sort of making an interesting parallel that, again, even within our congregation,
Yes.
in order to try to sort of focus on particular lectionary topics
Yes.
and avoid ambiguity,
Right.
most adults don't deal well with any of that as well.
Yes.
And so it's certainly not something that's unique to
To
freshmen or
youngsters,
sophomores
yes.
in college.
But they have so much less life experience to call upon to try to, the kind of wisdom that they might need in order to deal with that.
Yeah.
That sometimes becomes evident in the classroom.
Yeah. Well, I find that, sometimes in older adults, well, they theoretically have,
Okay.
many more years of, life experiences. They don't necessarily leverage that all that.
Yes, right. Find ourselves in a rut or whatever with our thinking. Yeah, good point. Yeah, thanks.
I have a question. It's very difficult for me to believe everything I read, even in the Bible, because I am a scientist. I question everything, and lately I say, like, how can I know that there's really divine inspiration in some of these very violent and contradictory books in the Bible? And it makes me question, how do I know? I mean, what is the basis of picking those books and putting in the Bible? And how can I believe that those books are really meant to be something to guide me in Christianity? I mean, who made the decisions, and how do I know those decisions are the correct ones? I mean, for all I know, is somebody decided that these books belong in the Bible.
Right.
I mean, is there any other book that you could recommend to understand this issue? Because, hey, you know, maybe this book doesn't belong.
Yeah, even when we talk about contradictions, not all of the text, all the books in the Bible are in agreement with one another on any issue, even the issue of suffering. Again, Ehrman's written a very fine book on the problem of suffering in the Bible. And he goes from, there are several answers that the Bible gives. It's not just one answer. And I think we're sometimes taught to think there's just one answer there. But there are many different answers given by many different people over time. And he finds some of them better than others. And so he talks a little bit about that in his book.
But
Yeah,
was
it's
there
hard.
a historical meeting of church leaders and they went through and determined which books were going to be going into the Bible?
Over time, there was an incremental process that happened within the first, the second, third, fourth centuries, even up into the fifth and sixth centuries. It actually wasn't absolutely decided by the largest church body up until the 1600s with the Council of Trent.
Yeah.
So that's when they said, no more arguing about this issue, these are in. And yet there was still Luther a little earlier on who was arguing about James, and some others calling him a right strawy epistle with James. He didn't like it, wanted to exclude it, but nevertheless he felt the pressure to put it into his German Bible, so he translated the Greek and put it in the Latin from the Vulgate. Yeah, no, these are hard questions. Thank goodness I don't have to deal with them, since I'm not a theologian. But theologians do struggle with that, and that's part of their task. And I think in some ways, if we find ourselves comfortable in a particular community, we have to give some trust to that community's decisions about certain issues like that. Doesn't mean we can't be skeptical, can't argue about them, can't debate them, can't think about them. If anything, what we want our students to do is think critically and ask hard questions and put us on the spot as professors. We don't walk into a classroom saying, you've got to automatically trust us. We walk in saying, okay, I'm ready, let me have it, you know, and have an actual debate with students sometimes. That's a good thing, as long as it's done carefully and with respect. That's what we want. But I think the answer comes in the degree of trust you have with any particular community that recommends that you look to these sorts of things as helpful. But then you struggle with it.
So for me, it sort of comes down to this issue of faith versus the pursuit of truth. And if one is seeking proof, then there isn't really room for faith. And so if you have proof, then in fact, you know, the answer in theoretical terms is not ambiguous. But I think God actually challenges us to actually have faith. And so for all practical purposes, we're never armed with proof. But we're asked to we're called into his life in faith. And so that doesn't mean that we don't wrestle with all the issues that you mentioned, because we do all the time. But,
and wrestling's the right question, and this is the sort of place to do that kind of thing, particular issues that you might have with this community to wrestle here. We don't wrestle with that in secular university, or we don't address the issue of faith. We don't always address as much as we probably should the issue of grace either. But nevertheless, we have to look at things from as an objective point of view as we possibly can. There's no such thing as pure objectivity. That's a myth as well. What you try to do is be as objective as you possibly can, and to teach students to learn how to do that, to be as open and as willing to challenge things as they possibly can.